Hey, I'm Bensley, and I'm in Brixton, London at the Dairy Studios, and I'm here to break down my track Hard Times with Emerdine, which is from my new album Muskoka. Check it out. Hi guys, this is my track Hard Times. It's featuring the vocalist Emerdine, and it's on my new album Muskoka, which just came out about a month ago. Um, and when I was asked to do this future music feature, it was a tough choice to find the track that I thought was the most informative and the most interesting to talk about. But I think this one stood above the rest as one that was the most diverse creatively and sonically. So I think there's a lot to talk about here, and yeah, I can't wait to get into it. So the whole track is it's definitely inspired by like liquid drum and bass. I've got like it's revolving around a jazzy vocal, me on the saxophone. It's got just like lush chords and sort of bending modulated bass lines, sort of inspired by True Romance. And the whole thing sort of breaks down into a swung eighth note jazz section in the middle, with a walking bass line and everything. And it was a whole lot of fun to work on. And it wraps up with a couple of quotes from one of my favorite saxophonists, Charlie Parker. It's an interview quote, and he talks about some things that resonated with me as a producer and an artist. So the whole track means a whole lot to me, and I think represents my musicality in the best way possible. So let's get into it. A lot of my ideas start from the bass line up. I like to write around chords, and in order to do that, starting with the root note is super helpful for my creative process and writing melodies and things like that. I actually don't usually flesh it out with the rest of the notes in the chord until I've got sort of a basis down with the bass line and other elements like the vocal and the lead and things like that. But for this tune in particular, I started with, I knew I wanted it to be jazzy, and I had this bass line going around in my head that sounded kind of melancholic and dark. And it sounds a little bit like this. So, in addition to the root notes there, I've also added an octave up that lasts for an eighth note at the beginning of each chord, and I do that to create movement in the chord, make it a little bit more interesting, and that's especially useful when you're translating it to a dance floor where the sub bass is where most of the movement in the track is heard. So it also makes it more present on smaller speakers if you have parts of the bass line that hit a higher octave for a bit. So that's what I've done there. And on top of that, I've added some pitch bend to sort of emulate the sound of True Romance by D-Bridge, which is an absolute classic. And in order to do that, of course, I've done it with the pitch automations within Ableton itself. And with that, it has even more movement. And, like I said before, it's incredibly important to have an interesting sub bass line for when the tune translates to a club. So in the final bass line itself, it should sound like this. So, like I said, after building the foundation for the chord, I like to flesh it out with another instrument. And in this case, I've used a piano, being that it's a jazzy tune, pianos being very prevalent in jazz. I thought I would take a shot at making a realistic sounding piano. Even though I've only programmed it in myself, I've tried to make it sound like someone is really playing it. And the piano itself sounds like this. In order to make it more interesting, rather than just flat chords being played over and over again, I have made the root note of the chord be played at the beginning of the bar, and the rest of the notes above that come in a beat later. And that sort of plays hand in hand with the way the bass line goes up an octave for that same amount of time at the beginning of each note. And for this, I'm just using the stock Ableton grand piano. Surprisingly, it sounds pretty good in this application, even though it's hard to make it sound like a real piano sometimes. It depends entirely on how you've programmed it. So through doing things like the way I've staggered the chords from the grid, and also, I don't know if you can see it, but there are slight deviances in which the notes of the chords are being played before and after, just slightly off the grid, to emulate the keystrokes of a real player, because there are obviously imperfections, and if you're going to be putting it in by hand, you have to simulate it. So that's what I've done there to make the stock Ableton piano come across as more of an authentic instrument. So in the following 16 bars after that phrase, I sort of bring the piano to the forefront a bit more and allow the virtual player of the piano to get a bit more creative with it, and it takes on a more rhythmic characteristic. So rather than just having straight chords, we now have sort of a stepping, grooving sort of repetition to it. And anyway, that sounds a bit like this. The ducking you're hearing is coming from the sidechain compression, which we'll touch on later, but that's not actually part of the arrangement choice here. So in order to achieve what I've done here, I've broken it up into two different piano layers. One which is just the bass line, and that's this. Some grace notes have been added to make it a bit more interesting. And the top layer is just doing the rest of the notes of the chords over and over again. The next element that I added after working on the bass line and the piano was this sort of cheesy, old-timey sounding bell lead. And it sounds like this. And I've done that to, well, firstly, I've put a ton of reverb and interesting sort of delays on it, because when this first comes in, it's behind the vocal. So I didn't want to take away from the vocal. So this is sort of haunting in the background. And when the drop comes in, it's a much more cleaner. It's much cleaner, and it's much closer to the forefront of the song. So it sounds like this. And when this is happening, it's still behind the vocal, but I'm trying to make the two sort of coexist at the same time and have a call and response pattern. So I've actually made that sound in massive. I don't have the original sound that would be used to make that at my disposal, so I've had to get a bit creative here with the plugins that I have in the box. And I'm a big fan of trying to make things sound a bit less perfect, a bit less out of a computer. So I love trying to throw distortion and saturation on things like this, detuning in order to just make it sound a bit more human. So the core sound is just a sine wave. So it's very simple. And all I've done is taken down the envelope and increased the release so it sort of has a sustain after you hold it. Maybe a bit longer than that. Because I want the notes of the melody to sort of overlap and create distortion within each other. Which doesn't happen before you distort it, but after I've done that, I sort of threw an LFO on the pitch, just very subtle, very slow, in order to create a pitch bend effect, sort of as though it's coming from a tape machine or something like that. A little bit of white noise. And that's about it. Most of that effect can be achieved from within Massive itself. For the sort of more distant and distorted variation, I've used Guitar Rig, and it's a super powerful plugin if you haven't used it already. You'd probably find that the presets themselves are more than enough. And in order to make a melody like this more interesting without knowing what I'm going for, I'll often open up Guitar Rig and just scroll through presets. And it can be on a very basic sound. You can still achieve an extremely interesting result. So that was, I mean, this is basically a preset right here. I've tweaked a few things, mostly just like turning off some of the excess stuff in there, but to make it fit within the mix. But yeah, I mean, you can just achieve so many interesting sounds just using Guitar Rig and throwing it on random sounds like this. So just by doing that, I've achieved a very interesting soundscape that it still exists long after the melody stops, and it fills the space wonderfully. So in the background there, it sounds just like this.
I've been foolish, I came too close, let you go too deep. I fed you false hope, a shallow hope that I need to relate.
So you can sort of hear the way that the melody is coexisting with the vocal here. So those are pretty much the key elements of the track. I've also thrown in some saxophone solos just to sort of put a bit more of myself into it. I don't have the original recording here, but what I've done to process it for this track is basically distort the hell out of it. I wanted it to be the one dirty, disgusting element in an otherwise clean track. So it sounds just like this. What you can't see from the audio clip right here is that it's actually a number of takes that I've sort of layered and woven in and out of each other in interesting ways, because some of the playing here isn't actually possible to do by one person. So that's me having a bit of fun with it, as well as I've recorded just me playing one stab on the saxophone, which is this. Put reverb on it, put it in the background at the back of, or at the beginning of every 4 bars, I believe. Yeah. And that just sort of creates a cohesion, just sort of a big wall of saxophone that is a bit more interesting than just, one line being played. Halfway into the track, we sort of break down into a swung jazz section. And while maintaining a lot of the original elements of the track, there are some things I did to achieve that, and those are mainly rhythmic. So the percussion section and the bass line are the key things that changed here. And it sounds like this. So, in order to adapt the percussion, which was originally, purposed for drum and bass, in order to repurpose that for a swung jazz section, I've stripped out everything except the kick and the snare. And also adjusted it to a triplet grid, and sort of reworked some jazzy samples to add in the other flavors of a jazz drum kit. So we've got the swung hat, and the brushes on the snare drum. And it turns out that this sort of groove lends itself really well to a drum and bass tempo. So I could keep almost everything else in the track identical, and it's a completely different feel. But it wouldn't be achieved without a walking bass line, which is sort of one of the quintessential elements to a lot of jazz pieces and a lot of popular jazz pieces, because it really creates a stepping groove to it. It goes hand in hand with the swung feel from the kit, and in my track it sounds like this. And you can hear at the beginning of the bar there, I've actually incorporated a real recording of an acoustic bass, but once the drums and the vocal kick in, I sort of just synthesize it from there. The vocals were fairly easy to process. Luckily, the amazing, talented Emer Deneen did a job that didn't require much processing at all. But in order to tastefully process it in a way that wouldn't stand out too much in a tune that's supposed to be jazzy, because the name of the game is simple if you're playing with acoustic music styles. So initially, processing this vocal track was mostly just a question of EQing and compressing it, just to, bring it up to the dynamic standard that the rest of the track is set. So quiet bits don't get lost, and loud bits aren't punching through too much. So I'll just play it now and add the effects onto it now.
Aim too close, let you go too deep. I fed you false hope, a shallow hope.
So very subtle stuff. Like I said, I'm not trying to completely squash it, but I would like it to be able to punch through the track on every word, every syllable, And the key effect that I've put on to make it fit into the atmosphere around it is another instance of guitar rig, which is very simple. It's just got a reverb, a delay, and something else there that I've turned off. But it was all about just giving it some atmosphere. And when that's on, it sounds like this.
I've been foolish, I came too close.
Yeah. Something I like to do a lot with my vocal processing is layering an octave below or an octave above, just to fill out the frequency spectrum a bit more. And also, depending on the algorithm you use to transpose a vocal track, you can also give it additional bite. So for example, on this section here, I've added a track an octave below, and it sounds like this.
times. Isn't losing enough, I'm losing my mind. Ooh.
So it's pretty subtle, which is how I like to use it, to be honest. On its own, it sounds like this.
Isn't losing enough, I'm losing my mind.
And upon transposing that, I've used the Complex Pro algorithm in Ableton, which if you mess with the formats a bit, you can sort of change the sound of the mouth, and depending on how much you transpose it, obviously quite a bunch here, it can create some interesting artifacts which I think sort of gloss over the vocal and add extra crunch to it, which is sort of what I was going for with that section. Amira was also so gracious to send me some ad-lib sections. They are few and far between in this track, which gives some extra impact. I try not to overdo it and let the main parts of the vocal, speak for itself. But I thought it was important to keep the momentum going between vocal phrases here. So one of the main ones here is it's just a very short one, and I've done a lot of processing on it to make it feel distant and fall into the background behind the main vocal, and sounds like this. So it's split into two layers. They both have the same processing on it, but one is an octave higher. So this is the higher octave. And together, you can't, like I've done with the octave below processing on the main vocal, this is very subtle, and but I think it gives it a more dreamy and ethereal quality to it. One more way in which I processed the vocal is for a part of the track in which I wanted it to feel distant, and in order to do that, I put more reverb and more delay, the same ones that I had on the main vocal itself, but I just turned up the dry wet, and in the context of the track, it sounds like this. So that's pretty much the basis of the track. The rest of it is a whole bunch of interesting sounds and effects that I've thrown in there. I did a lot of sampling, and they don't take a whole lot of explanation, beyond little tricks that I did with reverb and delay and compression and filtering just to fit them into the mix better. But yeah, I could just show you some right now. And this is a funk guitar that I've sampled off an old record, and it just sort of, it's peppered in for the first 16 bars of the intro, just sounding like this. So it's very simple. All I've done is duplicate the clip over and over and reverse it every second bar just to create a cresting, rise and falling sort of pattern there. I sampled another guitar that just sort of carries us into the drop. It's a bit eerie. It sounds like this. Also with, lots of reverb and delay and compression. I've got a string sample that sort of contributes to the old-timey, cheesy feel of this record, and it sounds like this. That one originally went on for much longer, but I stretched out that last note there to just fit in to the frame I was trying to use it for. This is one that I've literally just used from freezing the reverb on the guitar track that I showed you before. And I have this sort of laying in the background for most of the track just to contribute to the atmosphere of it and sort of fill up the space. And it sounds like this. So very helpful for creating a wall of sound is having elements like that just sitting in the background. I hope you enjoyed, and I hope you learned something. This has been my track Hard Times from my new album Muskoka. If you like what you heard, please check it out. It's on Ram Records, and check out the rest of the album too. Cheers.